Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Sweet Land of Liberty, Old Times in the Colonies by Charles Carleton Coffin, narrated by Bob Souer. Preface. The settlement of our country was the beginning of a new era in human affairs. The people of England, ever since the days of King John, when the barons compelled him to sign the Magna Carta in the meadow of Runnymede, had struggled against tyranny, and when the emigrants sailed across the Atlantic to rear their homes in Virginia and New England, it was the transplanting of liberty to a continent where everything was new, and where the conditions that surrounded them were wholly unlike those of the Old World. This volume is an outline of some of the principal events that transpired during the colonial period of our country, and portrays the hardships and sufferings of those who laid the foundations of a new empire. It will show how the Old World laws, habits, and customs were gradually changed, how the grand ideas of freedom and the rights of man took root and flourished. It covers the period from the discovery and settlement of America to the Revolutionary War. In 1876, I wrote a volume entitled The Boys of '76, a narrative of the battles of the Revolution and of the trials and devotion of our fathers in establishing the independence of the United States. While preparing that work, I discovered that there was no volume in existence that would give the young people of our country an idea of the struggles of men in England and Europe against the tyranny of emperors, kings, popes, archbishops, bishops, and inquisitors. To supply that want, I wrote a second volume entitled The Story of Liberty, which traced a chain of events through a period of 500 years, from the signing of the Magna Carta to the settlement of Jamestown and Plymouth. This volume, therefore, fills the gap between the others in time, and together they make a series, not of general history, but an outline history of the progress of ideas. I desire to call your attention to a few things which will be made plain in this volume. You will notice that the beginning of the history of our country is clear and distinct, while the beginnings of the histories of other countries are obscured by tradition or made doubtful by fable. Our early history is definite, the early history of other lands uncertain. The history of a nation is like the flowing of a river. There are many rivulets starting wide apart, which unite to swell the ever-deepening stream. Many of the fountainheads of American history are in England and Europe, and in order to obtain a correct view of what transpired in the colonies, we must cross the Atlantic and follow the rivulets to their sources. The tracing of the relationship of one event to another, and showing their effect upon the human race, is the philosophy of history, and by studying the philosophy we are able to arrive at some conclusion as to its meaning. You will notice how, through priority of discovery, Spain, France, and England claimed various sections of this continent, and how conflicting claims led to a great struggle between England and France for supremacy, that it was a conflict between two races, two languages, two religions, two systems of laws, two distinct civilizations, that great ideas were behind the struggle. In the opening chapter, you will hear how John and Sebastian Cabot sailed along the northern coasts, how Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence. The closing pages will picture a battle on the Plains of Abraham. It was an engagement which lasted only a few minutes, yet it was one of the great decisive battles of the world, momentous in its results. John and Sebastian Cabot, Cartier, Champlain, the kings of France and England, the Pope, Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuits, Oliver Cromwell, the Pilgrims of the Mayflower, the Puritans, are as inseparably connected with that battle as William Pitt, James Wolfe, and the Marquis de Montcalm. The history of the entire colonial period leads up to it. You will notice that the forces of nature, the turning of the earth upon its axis, the flowing of the Gulf Stream, the contour of mountain ranges, the courses of the rivers, have had a far-reaching influence upon the history of our country. The rivers were the highways along which the Indians paddled their canoes to fall upon the settlers, along which the armies of England and France marched to engage in battle. Mountains were barriers, stopping a while the progress of civilization, and also shielding the colonies from attack. Not only these, but the order of the Pope forbidding people to eat meat on Fridays, saints' days, and during Lent, but granting permission to eat fish, the desire of the people of Europe to wear hats made from the glossy fur of the beaver, the love for tobacco, their ideas of holding men in slavery, are forces that have had much to do in shaping the history of our country. The longing for adventure, the hunger for gold, led to the settlement of Virginia. Through convictions of duty and obligations to God, the Pilgrims were driven from England to Holland and across the Atlantic to begin self-government and to give to the world the ideal of a written constitution. The hatred of the Puritans to the ritual of the Church of England, the determination of the bishops and archbishops to compel them to conform to it, are great fountainheads of history. The inner light which illumined the soul of George Fox, the stern convictions of Roger Williams, of his obligation to conscience, are forces which give direction to the course of events. All the motives by which men are actuated, their passions, affections, religious convictions, the selfish ends, are part and parcel of the grand drama of time. I have spoken of the meaning of history. Surely it has a meaning, else what are we living for? Whichever way we turn in the material world, we find things needful for our use, and we think of them as God's forethoughts, and as design for our welfare. If there is design in the material world, there must be some meaning to history, some ultimate end to be accomplished. In The Story of Liberty, and in this volume, you will see how tyranny and wrong have fought against liberty and justice, how that banner which the barons flung to the breeze at Runnymede, inscribed with the rights of man, which Cromwell bore amidst the carnage of Marston Moor, which waved from the masthead of the Mayflower when that lone vessel crossed the Atlantic, has never been trailed in the dust in this Western world. But tyranny and wrong have gone down before it. Through the colonial period there was an advance of principles which are eternal in their nature. All through those years, conditions and influences were preparing men for self-government. Men die, generations come and go, but ideas live on. When the world was ready for it, and not before, the American Revolution came with the announcement that all men are created free and equal and endowed with inalienable rights. Through all the narratives of wars, massacres, and bloodshed, you will see right, justice, and liberty ever advancing. Old Times in the Colonies, therefore, is not an unmeaning record of events, but the story of the rise of a great nation, the growth of individual liberty, the coming in of constitutional government in this Western world, the history of the first period in the new era in human affairs. As you listen to this book, the conviction, I trust, will come that, under the power of great ideas, our country is leading the human race in its march toward a state of society inexpressibly grand and glorious. Charles Carleton Coffin. Chapter 1. Discovery of San Salvador. There it was, a green and sunny island. Christopher Columbus beheld it in the dawning light of October 12, 1492, an earthly paradise with stately trees, fragrant flowers, groves of oranges and bananas, hanging vines, birds of bright plumage, and groups of dusky men, women, and children. It was San Salvador, one of the Bahama Islands. A few days later, Columbus discovered Cuba and Hispaniola, now known as Santo Domingo, and returned to Spain with the wonderful news. Who owned the islands? They were occupied by Indians, but the Pope, Alexander VI, Roderick Borgia, wicked and cruel, a murderer, claiming to be God's agent on earth and endowed with all power, gave all lands that might be discovered west of an imaginary line, drawn north and south 100 leagues west of the Azores, to Ferdinand and Isabella, King and Queen of Spain. So, by priority of discovery and by the decree of the Pope, Spain entered upon the possession of what Columbus had discovered. The news reached England. The merchants of Bristol who were sending their ships to France, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea applied to the king, Henry VII, for leave to send out an expedition for the discovery of new lands. "If you discover any countries, they shall be mine," he said, asserting his right to hold or give away lands against that claimed by the Pope. "If you make any money by the expedition, 1/5 of it shall be mine," he added. The merchants accepted the conditions, fitted out 2 vessels commanded by John and Sebastian Cabot, father and son, 2 Venetians in their employ as sea captains. In May 1497 the ships sailed down the river Severn and steered west for a voyage over unknown seas, where vessels had not sailed since the days of the old Northmen. In June they found themselves on soundings, and the sea around swarming with codfish. The water was warm, and dense fogs arose. A little farther on the water was colder and filled with icebergs. They had reached a place where 2 great currents of the ocean meet. They did not know, nor was it till many years later that anybody knew, what caused the flowing of these currents, that the earth was whirling around the sun and also turning on its own axis, that the speed at the equator was 18 miles a minute. We now know that the revolution of the earth upon its axis sets the water between Africa and South America to flowing westward, and that when the current strikes the coast of South America it is divided, a part flowing south and part north. The northern section, carrying with it the fresh water brought down the Amazon and Orinoco from the Andes and the plains of South America, sweeps into the Caribbean Sea and whirls onward to the Gulf of Mexico, being heated by the sun to a temperature of 86 degrees. The Mississippi pours in its mighty flood, bringing minute particles of soil from the far distant prairies and mountains. Having no other outlet, the waters rush through the passage between Florida and Cuba, tearing great masses of seaweed from the beds of white coral which the coralline insects are building beneath the waves. This river of hot water, 1,000 feet deep and 50 miles wide, sweeps on at the rate of 5 miles an hour, bearing the soil of 2 continents, the seaweed and myriads of marine insects, polyps, star and jellyfish in infinite variety. East of Newfoundland it meets a current of cold water flowing south from the frozen region of the north, bringing great icebergs, but the warm current whirls them northeast, speedily melting them, dropping the stones and gravel torn from the shore of Greenland beneath the sea. The fine particles of sand brought down from the Andes by the Amazon and from the prairies of the west by the Mississippi also settle to the bottom of the sea, thus making that portion of the sea a great dumping place, building up the bank of Newfoundland. The hot river supplies the codfish with food, gives a mild climate to England, and makes it possible for men to live in Iceland and northern Norway. John and Sebastian Cabot caught all the fish they needed and, sailing still west, on June 2nd beheld the waves breaking against the rocky shore of Labrador. Since the days of the old Northmen, no European eye had seen the mainland of the western world. The Cabots sailed northward along a bleak and forbidding coast, with dense forests beyond the white granite ledges. They saw white bears, floating on cakes of ice, plunge into the sea and catch fish in their paws. Walruses and seals frequented the shores, and myriads of birds reared their young upon the rocky cliffs. But their provisions failing, they returned to England. What a year for discovery was 1498. Stimulated by what he had seen, Sebastian Cabot, young, sagacious, bold, sailed once more westward. He coasted along the southern shore of Newfoundland, entered the Bay of Fundy, gazed upon the cliffs of Mount Desert, the majestic pines of Maine, the sandy beaches of Cape Cod, sailing southward to Virginia, thus, by priority of discovery, enabling England to claim the continent from Labrador to Cape Hatteras. Christopher Columbus, at the same time, was making his third voyage, discovering the island of Trinidad, the coast of South America, and Orinoco. He landed and drank from a spring that still bears his name. There was another brave sailor on the seas, Vasco da Gama of Portugal, who was sailing south along the west coast of Africa, doubling the Cape of Good Hope. Sailing on till, through the ocean haze, he beheld the mountains of Hindustan, thus opening a long-sought-for route to India. There was still another voyager on the seas, Amerigo Vespucci, a merchant of Florence, engaged in trade at Seville in Spain, who, animated by a spirit of adventure, sailed to the West Indies with Captain Ojeda, and from thence to the coasts of South and Central America. He wrote interesting accounts of what he saw, which were published in 1507, probably the first printed narrative given to the public of the discoveries in the West. The pamphlet fell into the hands of Martin Waldseemüller of Freiburg in Germany, who translated it into German. People spoke of the New World as Amerigo's country, and thus the name became attached to the western continent, though the honor of discovery belongs to John and Sebastian Cabot. The King of Portugal, desiring a share in the New World, sent Gaspar Cortereal upon a voyage of discovery, who sailed along the coast of North America from Virginia northward to Newfoundland. He enticed a number of Indians on board his ships, and treacherously carried them to Portugal and sold them into slavery. Men do not like to grow old. How gladly would they ever retain the freshness of youth! The longing to be young again became a passion with Ponce de Leon, governor of Puerto Rico. The gray hairs had come, and there were furrows in his cheeks. Poets had written of a fountain of perpetual youth, a stream so clear and pure and life-giving that those who drank of it would be forever young and fair. De Leon resolved to go in quest of it, that, tasting its refreshing waters, he might be ever young. He sailed from Puerto Rico with 3 vessels in 1513. On Easter Sunday, which the Spaniards called Pascua de Flores, he sighted land a few miles north of St. Augustine, and took possession of the country for the King of Spain, naming it Florida. He was charmed by its scenery, the wide-spreading live oaks, the fan-leaved palmettos, the tangle of jessamine and honeysuckle, filling the air with fragrance. But vain his search for the fabled fountain of eternal youth, and, after coasting along the shores, landing here and there, and exploring the country, he returned to Puerto Rico. The Spaniards in the West Indies heard of the wonderful land of Mexico, inhabited by millions of people, a land of cities and villages, cultivated fields and gardens, abounding in silver and gold, advanced in arts and architecture, with schools, courts of justice, and great stone temples. On the 15th of February, 1519, an expedition commanded by Hernando Cortes sailed from Ravenna to conquer the Empire of the West, landing first in Yucatan, again at the mouth of the river Tabasco in the Bay of Campeche, fighting a battle on the banks of that stream, sweeping the Indians down like grain before the reaper by his cannon and volleys of musketry, beginning a series of conquests that made him master of the empire of the Montezumas, and extending the authority and dominion of Spain westward to the Pacific, and northward to the Colorado and the Rio Grande, establishing the religion of the Roman Catholic Church and the language and civilization of Spain over that vast section of North America. The Spaniards were in need of more slaves to work in their mines and cane fields, and to obtain them Vasquez de Ayllon visited the coast of South Carolina in 1520. He called the country Chicora and entered the Combahee River, which he named the Jordan, and gave the name of St. Helen to the cape which bounds St. Helens Sound on the south. The Indians received him kindly, accepted his trinkets, flocked in great numbers on board the ships, when he treacherously seized them, hoisted his sails, and carried them away. But it was to little profit, for knowing nothing of the Gulf Stream, one of his vessels was borne upon rocks by the current and wrecked, while upon the other the captive sickened and died. D'Ayllon made his second appearance in St. Helens Sound in 1525, where one of his vessels was wrecked. The Indians attacked him and drove him on board his ships, mortally wounding him. Instead of conquering them and establishing the Spanish language and the Catholic religion in Carolina, as Cortes was doing in Mexico, he returned to Cuba to die. Francis I was King of France. He had desired to be Emperor of Germany, but his rival, Charles V of Spain, had been elected instead. Besides this, the Pope had given the whole western continent to Spain. "I should like to be shown the clause in the will of Adam which disinherits me in the New World," he bitterly exclaimed. Francis dispatched John Verrazano on a voyage of discovery in the ship Dolphin from Dieppe, January 24, 1524. He reached South Carolina in March and sailed northward along the coast, entering Narragansett Bay and the harbor of Newport, Rhode Island, passing around Cape Cod to the coast of Maine. He landed in many places and had interviews with the Indians. In January 1525, Stephen Gomez sailed from Corunna in Spain, entered the Hudson River on St. Anthony's Day, June 13th, named it St. Anthony. He seized some of the Indians, taking them to Spain and selling them. The country was cold, and he reported that Spaniards could not live there. Hunger for gold, desire for conquest, zeal for the establishment of religion, thirst for adventure, are there any stronger motives than these to lead men to brave danger or endure hardships? Moved by such motives, Pamphilio Narvaez, Cabeza de Vaca, and several hundred young men from the rich and noble families of Spain sailed from the Guadalquivir for America, landing in Tampa Bay on the west coast of Florida, April 14, 1528, taking possession of the country for the King of Spain. The Indians that flocked around them were in possession of gold ornaments. When asked where they obtained them, they pointed to the north. Narvaez marched in that direction. There were 300 in the party with horses and small cannon. Never before had the eyes of the adventurers beheld such gloomy solitudes, dense forests of pine, dark groves of cypress, wide-spreading oaks with long trails of gray moss drooping from the branches, magnolias filling the air with their overpowering fragrance. They toiled through swamps. Bays, inlets, and rivers impeded their progress, and their way was blocked by decaying trees torn up by whirlwinds and blasted by lightning. They saw strange animals, the opossum that carried its young in a pocket. Panthers prowled around them, and bears. At every stream they were compelled to construct rafts. They had little to eat. They expected to find rich and populous Indian towns, but only beheld clusters of wigwams. In August they were at St. Mark's on Apollodory Bay, but their ships had not arrived, nor did they ever see them again. They began the construction of boats, making their swords into saws and axes, their stirrups and the bits of their bridles into nails. They plundered the Indian cornfields to obtain food, and ate their horses. They twisted the film of the palmetto and the hair of their horses' manes and tails into ropes, caulked the seams of the boats with grass, and smeared them with pitch, sewed their shirts together for sails, made water bottles of the skins of their horses, and on the 2nd of September embarked, 250 in number, in 5 frail vessels, so deeply loaded that the gunwales were hardly 6 inches above the water. They seized some Indian canoes, split them in pieces, and built up the sides of their boats. Slowly they crept along the shore westward. On the 30th of October they reached the Mississippi and tried to enter it, but the currents swept them back. On the 5th of November, 2 of their boats were wrecked not far from Galveston, and the others were driven out to sea. Of the company, all but 4, de Vasca, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevarico, perished. They made themselves at home among the Indians, learned their language, passed from tribe to tribe, traveled northward through Texas to the Canadian River and westward to the Rio Grande, and from thence to San Miguel in Sonora, which they reached in 1536, where they found some of the soldiers of Cortes who conducted them to the city of Mexico. Jacques Cartier, a Frenchman, entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1534 and set up a cross at Gaspé, claiming the country for France. The next year he made a second voyage up the St. Lawrence, beheld the gloomy gorges of the Saguenay, and dropped anchor in the Bay of Orleans. Upon the northern shore, under a rocky cliff, was a cluster of wigwams. The Indians called the place Stadacone. Little did Cartier think that on the plateau behind the town the last decisive battle between France and England for supremacy in America would be fought, that upon the site of the wigwams would rise the city of Quebec. Cartier sailed up the river in a boat to a town which the Indians called Hochelaga. A hill which overlooked the town and all the surrounding country he named Mont Royal, which time has changed to Montreal. The ice closed around Cartier's ship before he could get away, and he spent the long winter at Stadacone, returning to France in the spring. Cabeza de Vaca, who had experienced such hardships in his journey from Florida through Texas to Mexico, reached Cuba. His accounts of what he had seen fired the ardor of Fernando de Soto, governor of the island, who had been with Pizarro in Peru. He resolved to conquer Florida, and landed on its western coast near Hillsborough River with 600 men, marched north through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, crossing the Mississippi near the boundary of Tennessee, exploring the country north to New Madrid in Missouri, and west to the western boundary of Arkansas. At the mouth of the Rod River, De Soto died and was buried beneath the waters of the Mississippi. The survivors of the party wandered in Louisiana till July 1543, when they constructed boats, descended the Mississippi, reached the Gulf, and made their way west to the Spanish settlements in Mexico. Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, while in Texas and Mexico, heard of a country still farther north which the Indians called Cibola. The governor of western Mexico, Coronado, resolved to conquer it. He dispatched 2 vessels up the Gulf of California, which ascended the Colorado River about 85 miles beyond the present boundary between Mexico and the United States. Coronado himself, with an army, marched to central Arizona and eastward to Santa Fe on the Rio Grande, claiming the country for the King of Spain. While Coronado was marching through Arizona, Francis de la Roque and Cartier were planning the colonization of Canada. They made a settlement at Quebec, but the winter was cold, the emigrants pined for home, and they went back to France. The Dominican priests in Cuba and Spain had set their hearts on converting the Indians of Florida, and in 1549 Luis Cancela and several other priests endeavored to establish a mission. The Indians had not forgotten the cruelties of Daillon, Navarrez, and De Soto, and in revenge killed several of the priests and compelled the others to leave the country. The Huguenots of France were heretics, and the Catholics were hunting them down. John Ribault of Dieppe turned his eyes to America as a place of refuge for himself and friends. He sailed to Carolina and left 26 men to begin a settlement at Port Royal. When he returned to France, civil war was raging, and he could send no supplies. The men at Port Royal were homesick. Their provisions failed. They built a small vessel and set sail. Some died, but the others were picked up by an English vessel and saved. 2 years passed. There was a lull in the strife between Catholics and Protestants in France, and Ribault began another settlement on the St. Johns River in Florida. Several hundred Huguenots with their families, weary of the strife in France, emigrated to Florida. The news reached Spain. French heretics on Spanish soil. What an outrage! They were Frenchmen and must be driven out, heretics and must be exterminated. A heretic, one who did not recognize the Pope as head of the Church, must be put to the sword as an enemy of God and man. Philip Melendez, fired with zeal for the Church, stimulated by the preaching of the Jesuit priests and bishops, quickly gathered an army. The high-born sons of Spain enlisted under his banner to wipe out the insult to Spain and to the Holy Catholic Church. A great company of priests joined in the enterprise. With 2,500 men he made his appearance on the coast of Florida. It was St. Augustine's Day, and he discovered a beautiful harbor to which he gave the name of the saint. He approached Fort Carolina. Ribault's vessels went out to meet him. A storm came on, and the French vessels were wrecked, but Melendez reached the harbor at St. Augustine. Fort Carolina was defenseless, and he marched overland, entered it without opposition, and massacred men, women, and children, old and young, sick and helpless alike. A few men only escaped on 2 little vessels. Upon the smoldering ruins of the fort, amidst the ghastly forms of mangled corpses, Melendez reared a cross with this inscription, "Not as to Frenchmen, but as Lutherans." The Jesuit priests chanted a Te Deum, and, laden with the spoil, the army returned to St. Augustine. The shipwrecked sailors of the French fleet, living on roots, frogs, and alligators, gave themselves up as prisoners. Their hands were tied behind them, and then the work of death began. Those who were Catholics were spared to become slaves. The others were inhumanly butchered. Beneath the palmettos on the banks where the alligators lay basking in the sun of the St. John's, and on the beach of the St. Augustine, lay the mangled bodies of 900 men, women, and children, murdered through bigotry and hate, while over the gloomy scene priestly hands held the cross, emblem of love and peace, amidst the chantings of a Gloria to Almighty God. The work of death done, the work of colonization began. Forts were built at St. Augustine, a town laid out, a chapel and houses erected. It was the first permanent settlement within the present boundaries of the United States, begun in 1565. Intelligence of the horrible massacre reached the ears of Dominic de Gourges in France. He was a Huguenot and wealthy, but of what value was wealth with so terrible a crime unavenged? He sold his estates, purchased ships, enlisted 150 men, sailed secretly, captured the garrison in a fort on the St. John's, hung the captives upon the wide-spreading branches of the surrounding trees with this inscription above them, "Not as unto Spaniards, but as to murderers." He was too weak to attack St. Augustine, and sailed for France, having only in part accomplished his purpose. Sir Francis Drake, with 3 ships, had passed through the Straits of Magellan to wage war upon the Spaniards in Peru. One of his ships had been wrecked, the others had sailed he knew not where, but in the Pelican he carried havoc to the Spanish towns. In June 1579 he was so far north off the coast of Oregon that his crew complained of the cold. In a spacious harbor, possibly in the Bay of San Francisco, he refitted his ships, made a map of the coast, and gave the name of New Albion to the country. From thence he sailed west across the Pacific, returning to England.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?